In the icy immensity of Alaska, where nature is unforgiving and the fight for survival is brutal, a small miracle happened. A predator on death's door, a stranger faced with an impossible choice, and a secret buried in the snow. What happened that night will challenge everything you believe about instinct and compassion. Imagine yourself on a freezing night where the silence is broken only by the sound of the biting wind and the snow crunching underfoot. The temperature plummets to deadly levels, and any creature that is not protected by safe shelter has little chance of surviving. But in the midst of this hostile scenario, a small figure moves in the snow. Something is there, hidden, trembling. A wolf cub, wrapped in a human coat, fighting to maintain the last thread of life he has left. Who put it there? Why? And above all, can he still be saved? This isn't just an animal rescue story. It is a true testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and wildlife. A moment where compassion faced danger, where a stranger's choice forever changed the fate of a helpless creature. Get ready to learn every detail of this unexpected encounter, because what happened next will surprise you. But before we continue this incredible story, I want to know from you, what would you do if you found a wild animal in trouble in the middle of the snow, alone and defenseless? Would you believe your instinct to help him, or would you think twice before acting? Comment below. Your opinion is very important. Here on the channel, each story told is more than a report. It is an invitation to reflect on the connection between humans and animals, on courage, empathy, and decisions that change lives. Your comment helps strengthen this community passionate about exciting and inspiring stories. So leave your like to support this type of content and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos, because what comes next is even more surprising. Now, let's go back to that freezing night and the decision that changed everything. Alaska has always been an unforgiving land, a place where only the strongest survive. The vast forests covered in snow hide mysteries that few dare to unravel. Night falls early in the harsh winter, and the absolute silence is broken only by the sound of the wind, howling like a dark warning that there, in that wild world, every minute counts. Temperatures plummet to deadly levels, reaching 30 degrees C, and the snowfall that covers the landscape turns everything into an endless white landscape. No living being should be there, exposed to the cruel cold of the morning. But that night, something unexpected changed everything. At first, it looked like just a piece of fabric thrown by the wind, but as he got closer, he realized that it wasn't just an abandoned coat. There, in the middle of the snow, huddled and shivering, a wolf cub could barely move. His fur was caked with ice. His eyes were half closed from exhaustion and the intense cold. The animal didn't cry, it didn't fight, it just trembled, its small and fragile body almost lacking the strength to react. But there was something even more intriguing. The puppy was not there by chance. He hadn't just gotten lost in the storm. He was wrapped in a human coat. The traveler felt his heart race. Someone had placed that puppy there. But who? And why? Who would have left such a young and defenseless animal in that deadly cold? Would it be an act of abandonment? Or was there something more behind this strange scene? He looked around, looking for signs of footprints, any clue that could explain the situation. But the blizzard had erased everything. If anyone had been there, they had already disappeared, and there was no way of knowing how long the cub had been fighting to survive. The dilemma was cruel. He knew better than to go near the young of wild predators. Where there is a cub, the mother is never far away, and an encounter with a desperate wolf could be fatal. But at the same time, ignoring that little being would be the same as condemning him to death. He hesitated, feeling the cold wind cut into his skin, and looked into the cub's eyes. There was no threat there, just a silent cry for help. Time was against him. If he stayed there for too long, they would both be in danger. Making a quick decision, he knelt down and pulled up his coat to better wrap the cub. The small body was so cold that it looked more like a piece of ice than a living being. He needed to act quickly or it would be too late. Carefully, he took the puppy in his arms and felt how light, weak he was on the verge of unconsciousness. With his heart racing, he started walking back to his cabin, which was a few kilometers away. The wind bit into his face, and each step became more difficult as the snow piled up. But he couldn't stop. The puppy needed warmth. He needed help. His instinct told him that this little life could still be saved, but he also knew that he could be putting himself in great danger. The distant howls of wolves began to echo through the forest, a sound that made his chest tighten. Could it be that the pack was looking for the cub? Were they watching his every move at that exact moment? The traveler quickened his pace, feeling the adrenaline rush through his body. He knew that if the wolves considered him a threat, he wouldn't stand a chance. But now it was too late to turn back. He had already made his decision, and now, all that was left was to move forward. Every step in the snow felt like a challenge. Every gust of wind a reminder that this was not an environment for the faint of heart. The traveler knew that the forest did not forgive mistakes, but something inside him pushed him to continue. The puppy, despite being weak, breathed against his chest, and that was enough to give him strength. He needed to get to the cabin before the cold overcame them both. The journey seemed endless, and the wolves' howls grew closer and closer. The traveler felt the weight of danger approaching, but he did not give up. He held the puppy tighter and continued advancing through the blizzard, not knowing that that night still had a surprise in store for him that would change everything. The wind cut into the skin like invisible blades, howling across the white expanse of Alaska. The snow fell mercilessly, covering everything in an icy blanket, erasing footprints, hiding stories, silencing any trace of life. The night was a mortal enemy, and any creature that ventured there without protection would have no chance of surviving. But in the middle of this inhospitable landscape, something clashed. Something broke the implacable perfection of the newly fallen snow. Mike, an experienced hunter who knew the forest like the back of his hand, noticed a dark figure partially buried by ice. His instinct screamed immediately. Nothing should be there. He squinted, trying to see better through the blizzard, and advanced cautiously. Each step sank into the snow, making the approach slow, almost agonizing. When he finally got close enough to make out what it was, he felt his heart speed up. There in front of him, a human coat abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The fabric was stiff, frozen from the extreme cold, partially covered by snow. But there was something wrong. The shape wasn't just that of a coat thrown in the wind, crushed by the weight of the storm. Something moved beneath him. Something small, something that trembled. Mike froze for a moment, every cell in his body on alert. It wasn't uncommon to find the remains of makeshift camps left behind by reckless hunters, but this was different. He bent down slowly, his gloved fingers touching the icy fabric, and carefully tugged at his coat. It was then that he heard it, a faint sound, an almost imperceptible groan, a lament lost in the wind. Mike's eyes widened. He knew that sound. With steady hands, he slowly opened his coat, and what he saw made his chest tighten. A wolf cub, small, fragile, shaking uncontrollably. His hair was caked with ice clinging to his thin body. He barely moved, breathing heavily, his eyes half closed, as if he were about to give up. Mike felt a lump in his throat. The scene was absurd. Who would have put that puppy there? Why? No wild animal would wrap itself in a human coat alone. That didn't make sense. He looked around, looking for signs, footprints, anything that could explain the situation. But the storm had already erased any trace of who might have been there before him. The cub was alone, abandoned. Mike felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. He had already seen a lot in his wanderings through the forest. He had already witnessed nature in its most brutal state. But this was different. That puppy shouldn't have been there. He was not a forest survivor. He had been left. And now it was up to Mike to decide his fate. Instinct said not to interfere. A wolf is a wild predator, and the mother could be nearby, desperately looking for her cub. If Mike caught the pup and the pack was watching, It could be fatal, but what would happen if he left it there? In the biting cold, such a small cub would not survive for long. He was already too weak. He was already on the verge of collapse. Mike clenched his fists. There was no time for doubts. He quickly took off his gloves and touched the cub with his bare hands. The body was so cold that it made his own blood run cold. The little creature wouldn't last a few more minutes there. Without hesitation, he wrapped the puppy in his own coat and brought it close to his chest, trying to convey warmth. He felt the small creature's heart beating weakly against his skin. He needed to act quickly. Mike looked at the forest around him. The wind howled, and in the distance he heard something that made his breath hitch. Howls, long, deep, carried by the wind like a dark call. The pack was close. Mike's heart pounded. If the mother wolf was there, he would have to leave quickly or prepare to face a confrontation he could not win. But there was something strange about those howls. They were not aggressive. They were not called hunting. They were laments. Whatever had happened that night, something was wrong. Very wrong. With the cub cradled against his chest, Mike stood up and began walking, ignoring the biting cold, ignoring the heavy snow that made his muscles burn with exhaustion. He needed to get to his cabin. He needed to give the cub some warmth before it was too late. Every step was a struggle. The wind was blowing against him, trying to push him back, but he kept going. The weight of the little wolf in his arms seemed to increase with each meter, as if the responsibility of that life was becoming more real, heavier. The howls didn't stop. Now they were coming from several sides, as if something was happening in the forest, something he still didn't understand. Mike gritted his teeth. He couldn't worry about that now. His focus was one, keeping that puppy alive. And then, something even more disturbing happened. Right in front of him, embedded in the snow like an ominous reminder, a torn piece of fabric flapped in the wind. Mike stopped, his chest rising and falling rapidly. It was a piece of the same coat he had found wrapped around the puppy. Someone was there. Someone left that puppy there on purpose. And now, a new question burned in his mind. If someone put him there, was that person still around? As Mike looked at those footprints disappearing into the snow, one question never left his mind. Who would have left the puppy there? And why? I confess that this doubt does not leave me alone. If you also feel that something has not yet been revealed, comment "The mystery continues," and let's try to unravel it together. The wind cut into the skin like invisible blades, and the blizzard grew increasingly intense, obscuring vision and making every step difficult. Mike held the little wolf against his chest, feeling the fragile, cold body of the creature that was fighting to stay alive. He knew he didn't have much time. The cub was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes half open showing exhaustion. But there was something there. A small spark of life that still burned. A remnant of hope. He couldn't leave him behind. But what worried him even more wasn't just the cub's critical condition. They were the footprints. Mike had hiked countless trails in Alaska. He knew the difference between animal and human footprints, and the marks around the place where he found the cub left no doubt someone had been there recently. And more than that, there was a pattern to them. They weren't just scattered footsteps, indicative of someone just passing by. They were deep, repetitive marks, as if someone had been standing in that exact spot for a while. Someone put that puppy there. But why? The idea that a person had left a wolf cub alone in the snow, wrapped in a coat, made his mind spin with theories. Could he have been a hunter, a researcher, or someone who for some reason believed that was the best place to leave it? But none of it made sense. No one in Alaska simply leaves an animal to die. And then, there was another question. If someone was there, where did they go? The footprints followed a path that disappeared in the storm. The ice was already beginning to cover them, erasing the evidence that someone had been there, and every minute that Mike stood still, the accumulated snow erased a little more. He knew that if he tried to follow them, he might get lost. The wind had already erased visual references, and he had no choice but to trust his own intuition. But what if that person was still around? The idea made his skin crawl. Alaska was no place for messing around. People didn't get lost there by accident. They didn't make impulsive decisions. If someone left that puppy there, it was because there was a reason he still didn't understand. Mike felt the puppy move slightly against his chest. The small body barely had any strength, but the survival instinct was still fighting. That rekindled something inside him. It didn't matter the reason. It didn't matter who left that animal there. He had already made his choice. With a quick movement, Mike adjusted the coat better around the puppy, holding him close to his body to prevent the cold from penetrating further into his skin. The little being needed warmth, needed shelter, needed to get out of there. He looked around one last time, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that someone might be watching him, and then left. Every step in the snow was a struggle. The wind whistled like a grim warning, and the storm seemed to grow stronger by the second. Mike knew he needed to hurry. Their cabin was about a mile away, but with the accumulated snow and the pup's extra weight, the walk seemed endless. The little wolf was breathing irregularly, and that worried him. He had seen animals in hypothermia before, and knew that if he didn't warm the cub quickly, it might simply pass out in his arms. With every meter he covered, the wolf's howls seemed closer, and Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Whatever was happening in those woods that night, he felt like he hadn't seen it all yet. And then, suddenly, he stopped. There it was again, another piece of fabric wrapped around a twisted branch swaying in the wind. It was the same color as the coat that wrapped the cub. This was no coincidence. Mike felt a shiver run down his spine. If he found two signals so close together, what else could be waiting for him ahead? He looked around, trying to see something through the blizzard, but all he saw was white and undefined shadows dancing in the distance. The storm made it difficult to do anything that wasn't just a few meters away. What was happening? Quickening his pace, he hugged the cub more tightly to him. The little one couldn't wait. The warmth of the cabin was the only thing that could save him now. The minutes dragged by, and each gust of wind seemed to steal a little more of his energy. His body was beginning to feel the signs of exhaustion, and his face burned from the biting cold. But he continued. And then, in the middle of nowhere, a new sound made his heart race. Steps, not yours, not from an animal. Human steps. There it was, muffled by the wind but unmistakable, the sound of snow crunching under boots. Mike froze in place. The forest was empty, or at least that's what he thought. Whoever it was, they weren't running, they weren't hiding. I was just walking. The sound was coming from somewhere to his right, mixing with the wolves' howls. But when he turned around, he only saw the darkness of the night and the incessant snow. He was not alone. The weight of the cub in his arms suddenly seemed to double. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, but his rational side told him it was worse. He needed to continue. Taking a deep breath, he forced his feet to move again, step by step, feeling the ice trying to pull him down, feeling his heart beating against his ribs. The footsteps disappeared. Or did he imagine it? The adrenaline mixed with the cold and tiredness could be playing tricks on his mind. He tried to ignore that suffocating feeling of being watched. But then, something even stranger happened. Right in front of him, in the middle of the path, was an object buried in the snow, a metal canteen. He recognized the shape immediately. Someone had passed by there recently. His chest tightened. This was no longer a mystery about a wolf cub. This was something much bigger. Who was this person? Where was she now? Mike didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing. Every minute standing there was a risk. Mike felt the weight of that note in his hands. Thank you. But who had written this? And why? The snow had already erased the footprints, leaving behind only the mystery. What do you think really happened? Write your theory in the comments and let's unravel this story together. The snow continued to fall mercilessly, covering the ground in a thick blanket that made every step difficult. The wind roared around Mike like an invisible beast, sending sharp gusts that seemed to pierce his heavy clothes. The cold was relentless, freezing the sweat on his forehead, making each breath a small cloud of vapor that soon dissipated into the frigid air. But none of that mattered. The only thought that dominated his mind was the puppy he carried in his arms, wrapped in his coat, so small and fragile that it seemed like a mere breath of life fighting against a cruel destiny. He needed to get to his cabin. I needed to do this quickly. With each step sinking into the snow, Mike could feel the cub's weight increasing, not because he was actually heavier, but because the responsibility on his shoulders grew greater and greater. The little wolf could no longer fight alone. His breathing was short. His tremors were weaker. It was giving in to the cold, and Mike knew he didn't have much time before the creature's body collapsed completely. It was then that he heard it. A low sound, coming from somewhere to his left, muffled by the storm. Howls, long, deep, carried by the wind like a dark call. His heart sped up. He knew what that meant. The pack was close. Mike stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkness around him. I couldn't see anything but the thick, swirling snow. But I knew they were there. There was no doubt. Could they be the baby's parents? Were they looking for you? Or had they simply sensed his presence in the forest and were now watching him, deciding whether he was a threat? Tension gripped every muscle in his body. He had encountered wolves before. He had heard howls like those on lonely nights in the middle of the forest. But I had never been in that situation. He had never carried one of them in his arms, never felt the invisible gaze of the pack on him with such intensity. Mike hugged the cub to his chest, protecting him from the wind, and continued on. I couldn't stop. Every second lost there diminished the little creature's chances of survival, and he refused to let it die. But the howls continued. Now they were coming from more directions. First from the left, then from the right, then further away, and then close again. They were circling. Instinct screamed in his mind. He had seen this behavior before. This was how wolves hunted. They surrounded their prey, tested their reactions, and when they felt the target was vulnerable, they attacked. Mike couldn't afford to be seen as a threat. He needed to demonstrate that he wasn't there to hurt anyone. But how to do this? The blizzard seemed to dance around them, distorting the sounds, making it impossible to know exactly where the wolves were. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like he was being hunted without even seeing the predators. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, but he knew that would be the worst mistake he could make. Running meant panic, and a panicked man, in the middle of the forest, carrying a wolf cub in his arms, was all a hungry pack needed to act. Taking a deep breath, he kept his pace steady, step after step, firm, without hesitation. His heart hammered against his chest, but he didn't allow his hands to shake. The howling continued, but the wolves did not appear, not yet. Mike looked at the cub, his cold nose barely moving. I needed to warm him up soon. I needed to get to the cabin before it was too late. Time seemed to drag by as he walked. The cold was cruel, sapping his energy, slowing his movements. But then, among the white shadows of the forest, he saw it. The dim light of the lantern he had left lit outside his cabin. To cabin. He felt a wave of relief course through his body, but he didn't allow his guard to drop. He knew he wasn't safe yet, not while wolves were prowling. Only a few meters separated him from the wooden door, but each meter seemed like an eternity. He didn't dare look back. He felt the eyes of the forest on him, the invisible presence of the pack watching his every step. Arriving at the cabin, he pushed the door with his shoulder and entered, quickly closing it behind him. The sound of the wind was muffled, and for a moment, the silence seemed deafening. But Mike wasted no time. He took the puppy straight to the fireplace, where the embers still held some heat. He took a dry blanket, wrapped it around the little creature, and began rubbing its cold fur, trying to stimulate its circulation. The puppy did not react immediately. Mike felt his heart sink. He knew that when a body is in severe hypothermia, heating it too quickly can be dangerous. It needed to be gradual. Then he took off his own gloves and held the cub's small paws between his hands, transferring his heat. Time seemed to stop. So, after long seconds of anguish, one movement. Faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The cub tried to snuggle deeper into the blanket, seeking warmth. Mike let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. He was still alive, There was still a chance, but just as he felt the first relief, another sound made his body stiffen again. Something out there. It wasn't the wind. It was something different. Something closer. Mike went still, his heart racing again. The wolves were there. They had followed his trail to the cabin. The silence was deafening. Outside, wolves prowled the cabin, their eyes glowing in the dark. Mike held his breath. Run or stay. Any wrong move could be fatal. In his place, what would you do? Comment, "The wolves have arrived," and tell me your choice, because this story isn't over yet. The silence inside the cabin was almost as heavy as the snow outside. Mike felt the heat of the fire begin to fill the room, but his mind was far from there. His eyes fixed on the puppy, now curled up on the blanket near the fireplace, still weak but breathing more regularly. He had managed to save him from the cold, at least for now, but the feeling of restlessness wouldn't leave him alone. Outside, wolves continued to roam the cabin. He could hear the muffled footsteps in the snow, the occasional howls that echoed through the forest. They were waiting. But what are you waiting for? He moved away from the puppy for a moment and looked at the coat that was still thrown on the wooden table. That was where it all started. The piece of clothing was a mystery in itself. A thick coat, suitable for extreme cold, but with signs of wear, as if it had already been through many storms. The snow had dampened some of the fabric, and as Mike turned it over to inspect it better, he noticed something different. The weight in your pocket. Something was in there. His heart sped up. He slid his hand into his frozen pocket and pulled out what looked like a piece of paper, hardened by the cold. But when he looked closer, he realized it wasn't just paper. It was a photo. Mike's fingers pressed against the edge of the portrait, and he frowned. The image, although a little damaged by the frost, was still sharp enough to reveal a detail that made his stomach turn. A child held a wolf cub. Not just any wolf. The same wolf he had found in the snow. Mike held his breath. The small animal in the photo, with the same grayish fur and bright eyes, was undoubtedly the same one that was now warming itself by the fire. But who was that child? Who had taken this photo? And then he flipped the image. On the back, hastily scrawled, a short to-the-point message made his mind spin. "Take care of him. He's the last hope." Mike felt a shiver run down his spine. What did this mean? Hope for what? Who had written this message? Who had left this puppy there knowing it could freeze to death? More and more questions accumulated in his mind. He looked at the cub again, as if he expected to find some answer there. The little one now breathed more slowly, seeming to finally give in to rest, warmed by the fire. But that photo, that message, that changed everything. This was no simple case of a lost puppy. Someone wanted him to survive. Someone put it there on purpose. And the most disturbing thing, this someone knew Mike would find him. He ran his hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. If that cub was so important that it was called the last hope, what did it mean to the wolves out there? What did it mean to whoever had left it there? And where was that person now? Mike got up, walking around the cabin, feeling the adrenaline return to his body. He needed to think. I needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. Outside, wolves continued to prowl. Now their howls seemed even closer, as if they were waiting for an answer. This story was far from over, and what came next was even more unbelievable. Mike turned the photo over in his hands, his heart racing. On the back, a hastily written note. "Take care of him. He is the last hope." But hope for what? And who would have left this message? Nothing made sense. What do you think is really happening? Reply in the comments and help me unravel this mystery. Pale morning light filtered through the cracks in the windows, casting soft shadows inside the cabin. The fire in the fireplace was still crackling low, spreading a welcoming warmth throughout the room. After an intense night, marked by uncertainty and tension, Mike finally allowed his body to relax for a brief moment. But not for long. The puppy stirred inside the blanket, making a low sound, almost a whine. His eyes opened, shining in the dim light, and for the first time since finding him in the snow, Mike noticed something different. The fragility was still there, but now mixed with something new. A spark of energy, a little spark of life. The little wolf was still weak, but it had survived the worst part. Mike ran his hand over the blanket, feeling the heat of the puppy's body. He had seen animals recover from extreme situations before, but this was different. This little wolf carried a mystery that he still couldn't understand. The photo, the message, everything indicated that there was something bigger happening there. Outside, the world remained silent, which was rare. The storm had dissipated, and the wind was no longer howling as it had been the night before. It was as if the forest was waiting for something. Mike slowly got up and walked to the door. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. Something inside him told him that as soon as he crossed that threshold, everything would change. He turned the handle and pulled the door out. The pristine white landscape of Alaska stretched out before him, with the faint sun reflecting off the snow like little diamonds scattered across the ground. But that wasn't what made his heart race. There, just a few meters from the hut, two imposing silhouettes stood. Two adult wolves. Mike's eyes swept over the animals, immediately noticing their posture. They were not in an attack position. They didn't growl, they didn't advance, they just watched. The cub, which had previously been motionless and silent, now raised its head, its ears flapping, and then, for the first time, it let out a small whine. A short sound, full of recognition. The wolves didn't move, but something in their stance changed. It was barely noticeable, but Mike felt it. They were waiting. His body stiffened. He knew that wolves could be extremely territorial, especially when puppies were involved. If those two were the little one's parents, any wrong move could be interpreted as a threat. Mike looked at the cub and then back at the wolves. The decision was before him. If he followed logic, he should let the cub go. Return him to his family. Let him return to the wild, to the world he belonged to. But then, the other side of the equation weighed on his mind. What if the cub was still too weak to survive? What if, upon freeing him, he didn't have the strength to keep up with the pack and ended up perishing in the snow? What if whoever left him behind knew something he didn't? The photo, the message. He is the last hope. What did this mean? Mike felt the tension build inside him. He always believed in nature, respected its rules, its invisible laws that maintained balance. But now, faced with this dilemma, I didn't know which path to take. The cub let out another sound, this time louder. He was more awake now, moving on the blanket, trying to lift his paws. The wolves kept their eyes fixed on him, without blinking, without looking away. Mike realized what was happening. The wolves were waiting for his decision. If he took a step back and closed the door, they would understand that they would not get their puppy back. If he placed the cub in the snow, he was handing him over to his family. And his fate. It was a dilemma between following logic or listening to your heart. The wolf kept her eyes fixed on Mike. There was no aggression, just silent waiting. He felt the weight of the decision. Return the cub to his family, or protect him until he was strong enough. What would you do in his place? Write leave or protect in the comments and tell me your choice. Because this story isn't over yet. The frigid air cut into Mike's skin like tiny invisible blades, but he barely felt it. His body was there, standing in the doorway of the cabin, but his mind was far away, spinning between doubts and conflicting certainties. The cub in his arms was now awake, its once fragile little body now showing signs of vigor, as if recognizing that something important was about to happen. He moved his ears, breathed more rhythmically, and his gaze fixed on the wolves in front of him showed that he knew exactly who those animals were. Mike held his breath for a moment. The creatures in front of him remained motionless, just waiting. There was no aggression in his eyes, just a deep silence. It was almost as if they had come to get something that had always belonged to them. The tension in the air was palpable. Mike had never been this close to wild wolves like this. Not like this, not in a situation like this. They were magnificent, their silhouettes standing out against the endless white of the snowy landscape. Its thick fur danced lightly in the wind, and its golden eyes were fixed on him and the cub. He knew he couldn't hesitate. Slowly, he pulled his coat around his body and closed it tightly. The pup wiggled in his arms, his warm little body pressed against Mike's chest. Every step he took next was crucial. It couldn't seem like a threat. He couldn't show fear. With his breathing controlled, Mike descended the first step of the cabin, sinking his feet into the snow. The sound of ice compressing under their weight broke the silence, but the wolves didn't move. The second step was heavier, his body weighed down by the responsibility of the decision he was making. The third was definitive. Now he was walking towards them. The cub suddenly stirred, as if it sensed something big was about to happen. His paws pushed against Mike's chest, his small body twisting with an energy he hadn't shown since being rescued. And then, without warning, he jumped. Mike barely had time to react. The cub lunged forward, launching itself into the soft snow with a muffled sound, and before he could even try to catch it, the wolves moved. It was too fast. The two adults rushed forward, surrounding the cub in a matter of seconds. It was impossible to predict what would happen. Mike lay still, his breathing caught in his chest, his muscles ready to react to any threat. But what he saw next was something he would never forget. The wolf approached first. His paws moved with silent precision, his gaze fixed on the little wolf who was now crouched low, head bowed in submission, as if he knew exactly what he needed to do. She lowered her nose and sniffed the cub. The moment was tense, a split second that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. But then something changed. Instead of attacking him, she let out a low, deep growl, but not threatening. It was something different, something ancestral. Mike watched as the little wolf lifted his snout in response and touched the wolf's face with his icy nose. A silent recognition. The other wolf, an even larger male, approached, observing the scene with attentive eyes. Mike realized there was no aggression in him, just a protective instinct. Then something even more impressive happened. The wolf looked up and looked at Mike. There was something profound in that look, something that wasn't purely animal. It was a mixture of recognition and respect, a silent gratitude. Mike felt a lump in his throat as the wolf stepped forward, her paws sinking into the snow. He didn't move. I didn't want to break that moment. She growled softly, and then lowered her head. A rare gesture, a clear signal. Respect. Mike held his breath. He had never seen anything like it. Wild wolves didn't do that. They protected their territories, avoiding human contact whenever they could. But this wolf, she knew. She recognized what he had done. And then, as if a silent command had been given, the pack began to move. The wolf turned around, her body gliding across the snow with natural elegance, and the male followed close behind. The cub hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting back to Mike almost as if he was expecting something. But then, with a small howl, he ran after his family. Mike remained still, his mind trying to take in everything that had just happened. The small pack headed towards the forest, and the snow began to fall again, covering the tracks left behind. Within seconds, they disappeared into the storm. Mike stood there, speechless. He had done the right thing, but something still bothered him. The same question that hadn't left his mind since the beginning. Who had left the puppy there? And why? Before disappearing into the forest, the wolf looked at Mike one last time. It wasn't a look of threat, nor of fear, but of something deeper, as if he wanted to say something, but what? Has this story really ended? Comment the truth. If you also feel there is still a mystery to be solved. Time passed. The winter in Alaska continued relentlessly, covering everything with its white, silent landscape. But something inside Mike had changed since that night. The following days were marked by a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and restlessness. Every morning, when he opened the cabin door, his eyes swept the vastness of the forest, as if hoping to see some clue, some answer, that would help unravel the mystery that still haunted him. The image of the wolves disappearing into the storm, taking the cub with them, was burned into his mind. But it wasn't just that. It was the way the wolf had looked at him, the way she lowered her head before leaving. That wasn't just any gesture. It wasn't a simple animal instinct. It was something deeper, something he couldn't fully explain. The howls of the pack could still be heard from time to time, echoing in the distance, mixed with the sound of the wind. Mike listened to them attentively, trying to recognize among them the cry of the little wolf he had saved. He wanted to believe that the cub was okay, that he had reintegrated with his family, that he was learning to survive in the wild world where he belonged. But the question still haunted him. Who had left it there? That photo, the scribbled message, everything indicated that someone at some point had to make a difficult decision. But who and why? Weeks passed without answers, until that morning. It was on a particularly cold day, when the gray sky indicated that a new storm was on the way. Mike had left early to check his traps along the forest. The silence was absolute, as always. Just the sound of the snow compacting beneath your boots and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. But then, something different caught his attention. A few meters away, a trail of human footprints cut through the untouched snow. Mike stopped immediately. His heart sped up. He did not receive visitors in that region. The cabin was isolated, far from civilization, and anyone who ventured into those lands would have to have a very strong reason to be there. Bending down, he analyzed the footprints. They were recent. Enough so that the snow hadn't completely covered them yet. Whoever it was had been there a few hours ago. Mike followed the trail cautiously, eyes alert for any other signs. Each step took him further from the cabin, and the tension grew within him. Then he saw it. Directly ahead, folded neatly on a fallen log, was a coat, the same coat. Mike stopped, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He knew it was the same. The worn fabric, the frozen creases, the same scuff marks on the sleeves. That was the coat that was wrapped around the wolf cub when he found it. Someone had left it there. His eyes scanned the surrounding forest, looking for any sign of movement, but there was no one. Slowly, he approached and reached for his coat. The cold had stiffened the fabric, but when he held it, he realized that something else was there. Something stuck between the folds. A piece of paper. His chest tightened. He pulled out the note and unfolded it with shaking hands. There was only one word written there, simply and directly. "Thanks." Mike stood there, still, with the note in his hands. The cold bit his skin, but he barely felt it. That simple, "thank you," carried an enormous weight. Who had left it there, and why? If this story moved you, there are many others waiting to be told. And some of them are even more surprising. For a moment, Mike just stood there, holding the note, feeling the weight of that single, mysterious thank you. It was then that he understood. He would never know who left that puppy there. I would never know the story behind it, the reason, the despair or hope that led someone to make that decision. But somehow this person knew the cub was alive. And more than that, I knew Mike had done the right thing. Subscribe to the channel now and come live each one of them with me.